Chapter 10. Terrorists. The hangar was on fire and his ship had been disemboweled by the explosion. Built-in countermeasures leaked foam around the more volatile sections of the ship to prevent a fuel source from igniting, but an entire wing had already been blown off. The instructor signaled for Olivia and Lemuel and pointed at the wreck with his eyes. They had gone through this drill hundreds of times, examined the wreck for a possible cause. Lemuel's semblance immediately was put to use, causing everything around him to slow down. Once the temporal field had been put up, Olivia began jumping between the flames and flexing around the hazards as they were still in the middle of forming. Squinting at the various perforations in the engine, she looked to see if she could come to a reasonable conclusion with everything at the scene of the crime. Her sharp eyes made her invaluable for forensic examination. Her attention span, however, made grasping wider concepts far more difficult. Her sense of humor developed into better study habits when she had learned her own way to approach the same things. The teams on guard kept their attention on their surroundings in case it was sabotage or setting them up for an ambush. Those focused on the wreck waited for Olivia to start giggling as a sign she spotted something. Time passed everywhere but where Lemuel was focusing. When Olivia continued to look up and down the charred ruins of the wing and engine, she only saw evidence of harm done without rather than within. Looking up from the ruins and quickly distancing herself from the wreck, the instructor turned to the hangar door and saw Tim walking in. Lemuel allowed his semblance to fade, and the portion of the wreck he slowed continued smoldering and folding in on itself. All eyes went to him as he waved them away with a frail old hand. "You won't find sabotage. It's bandits. They've been stealing long-range technology from us for weeks. My deepest concern is that my presence would draw them here." Allowing anger to fade from his face, trust returned to the instructor's expression and began to approach him. The students followed, assuming he would need an honor guard in case he was lying. He waved them away, engaging all of their muscle memories back to their combat positions. "Do you know where they are?" He turned around to face the students, but maintained the conversation. "It's been a while since we fought humans." Nervous glances passed between the students as they began to consider the possibility that another war was beginning. No one wanted to voice the unspoken dread, but it was plain enough on their faces. Tim responded as if they were the only ones speaking to each other. "I do. And I'd be happy to provide the evidence of their communications with us, rejecting all possible means of peaceful coexistence." Olivia had moved behind Daniel, whose armor was absorbing the heat nicely. Havaliah also stood by and gestured for her to ask her question. "So they're not an army. They're just criminals?" Tim nodded. "Yes, young lady. The moment dust was discovered as a viable resource for weapons as much as fuel, they've been robbing weapons and looking for any excuse to use them. They hadn't accepted food apart from what they've taken from others. They haven't accepted any peace unless we give them half of all we have and recognize the message of the mountain as superior. They're dangerous, as you've seen, and now they apparently discovered I was bringing you all your weapons. They wanted them for themselves." The instructor stepped forward, understanding the implication of his friend's words. "Students, you are true children of vacuo. You stand as a mere dozen where an entire generation was either swallowed up by the desert or our true enemy. Do not let that strength falter now." Gideon's visor remained fixed on the rocks a mile from the hangar's overlook. Havaliah and the others turned their eyes to whatever was holding his attention and saw several flashes of metal among the rocks. This glint was enough to give away the position of a missile launcher they had disassembled. The instructor looked at Olivia, who smirked with a remark before disappearing. "Amateurs." Havaliah began running ahead, knowing her abilities allowed her to cover more ground than the rest of her team, with little consequence later in battle. She had drilled this hundreds of times whenever they had gone on a grim hunt. Run ahead, fight an advantageous position, mark for Olivia, meet back with Gideon and Daniel. Simple. She knew these campus grounds well regardless. She ran them 3 times a week for physical exercise. Figuring out the difference between cheating and utilizing natural talents was a problem the instructor never bothered to solve. Her smirk faded as she got closer to where they saw the group. Slowing down and lowering herself to shoulder height, she continued to move until she found any sign of the bandits that shot at their school. When she began to see movement, she ducked down and waited until she heard noises. Her heart never passed 90 beats per minute thanks to her semblance, so controlling her breathing wasn't a problem. The moment she heard voices, her eyes looked around to see where would be the best place to put them at a disadvantage. The rocks were on a fairly level plain, but the rocks themselves varied in size. She reached into her pocket and unwrapped the padding around a fresh egg Daniel gave to her before she started running. Why he always had one on him was matter she'd rather not inspect at the moment. Throwing it at the tallest rock and allowing Olivia to pick up its smell, she took one more glance to make sure she wouldn't be spotted and began running back to her group. The people in the rock started to notice her and began signaling to each other. However, after spotting the egg and noticing she was running back to the school, they began laughing and raising fingers instead of weapons. "I guess they aren't too different from the Grimm after all," Havilah muttered to herself once she had crossed 800 yards and far enough to feel safe from small arms fire. 2 minutes passed before she caught up with Daniel and Gideon, who were jogging as instructed to preserve their strength and accommodate for the weight of their armor. Havilah dug her boots into the ground to turn herself around after running between the two of them, and proceeded to slap their thighs. "Yah, mules, yah!" Gideon and Daniel took the abuse with grace. Both feigning wide swings at her head, she mockingly blocked with her knife. Once they had decided on a formation, she began explaining what they had in store. 20 soldiers, light camouflage, and medium-range dust armaments. Take advantage of cover. Daniel looked back at her as they continued moving. "Did you throw the egg?" Havilah tilted her head slightly to the left. "Why do you always have those on you?" Daniel shrugged. "Keeps icky girls away from me." Havilah's shoulders dropped. "Olivia doesn't seem to mind." Daniel smiled. "I said icky girls." Havilah kicked the back of Daniel's heel, almost causing him to trip. "I didn't know you were courting, you sly fox." Havilah attempted to do the same to him, but Gideon saw it coming and rushed forward to make her stumble. Voices began to be heard, which meant they had come within 800 meters of their target. Daniel and Gideon became aware of this as well and began switching from a casual mindset into their training. Daniel rolled his shoulders with every other stride, and Gideon began raising his blade towards the nearest visible threat. "Remember, we're vanguard. Buy time for the other 9 to get here." The boys nodded in order to keep breathing properly as they approached the nearest rock. Then the first shot was fired.